The concept of sugar as an addiction has been a topic of debate within and outside of the scientific community. Today, we are diving into that topic. Is our sweet tooth merely a matter of our preference, or is there something more profound at play? Let's find out. Hi folks, welcome to my channel, or welcome back. My name is Kat. I'm a licensed registered dietitian nutritionist, and on this channel I like to talk about weight inclusive, weight neutral focused approaches to health, as well as diving into scammy and, in my opinion, unethical nutrition related businesses, products, mostly nutrition related MLMs, and other fear mongering nutrition related claims. If you are ready to dive into the case for and the case against sugar addiction, let's go. Starting off, there's a lot to talk about in this video, but starting off, let's discuss some of the roles that sugar plays within or can play within our daily lives. Every cell in our body relies on glucose, which is a type of sugar for energy. Imagine your body as this vast city, very active. Everybody in the city needs energy to function. And for our bodies, this energy comes from glucose primarily. Now, this includes every cell from our brains all the way through our bodies down to our toes. Now, you might be asking, where does this glucose come from? We naturally derive the glucose from the foods that we consume, specifically from carbohydrates. Now, glucose or sugars is found naturally in things like fruits, vegetables, honey. And when you're thinking about the sugars that comes in fruits and veggies, those are really packed alongside of fiber and a lot of other micronutrients in there, and a lot of water as well. And at the same time, we have what's called refined sugars. Now, these you'll typically find added into beverages or different snack items, various foods. Those are specifically introduced during the processing portion and can sometimes lead to a quicker change in blood sugar levels, especially when consumed in isolation rather than mixed together with protein and fats in what we consider a full meal. Now, this can be extremely helpful for someone who is experiencing hypoglycemia or a low blood sugar, or right before a physically demanding activity, sometimes before lifting. If I know that we're gonna do heavy back squats or deadlifts, I'm gonna include some kind of really easily digestible refined sugars as a snack before class, because it makes such a difference. But that kind of sugar might help us to not feel physically the best, especially right before a low energy kind of activity. So if the goal is to sit at the desk and get a lot of mental work done, having something like a refined sugar on its own specifically, not typically going to be the best choice for energy purposes. Now, if you're familiar with this channel, then you probably know that I am not a fan of seeing foods as good or bad. Food, I see it really on a spectrum where we can approach it with curiosity, compassion, and context in order to make the best choices for our situation, for what we need the food to do for us in this moment, and also long term for whatever that means for that person. So really making informed choices and empowered choices rather than following this kind of good or bad list. And approaching foods neutrally allows us to see what are some of the potential benefits or potential cons, and what is going to be outweighed in order to make a choice that fits and works best for our lives and for ourselves. Now, when we're talking about sugar addiction, part of the conversation is on what might be known as the sugar high. When people are talking about the sugar high, they're typically referring to this kind of rush of energy that's also typically followed by a drop in energy. And that is after consuming something that is a per percentage of what the food is, pretty high in sugar. Now, when we consume sugary foods, our brains can release what is called dopamine, and we can think of dopamine as this feel-good messenger in our brain. It's a little burst of happiness that signals pleasure and reward. Now, you might have heard of dopamine in context of certain or specific activities, or in the context of specific substances. But a really important factor to keep in mind, or a really important statement to keep in mind, is that dopamine is not exclusive to sugar or substances that you might consider as harmful. Many everyday activities can lead to this kind of release of dopamine, including dancing, if that is something you really enjoy. Also listening to your favorite music, sharing a laugh with friends. That pleasure, that kind of reward, that's dopamine at play. But at that same time, nobody is really arguing that having a laugh with your friends or listening to music is this kind of addictive activity that should be avoided. So while it's true that sugar promotes this kind of dopamine release in our brains, giving us that characteristic like sugar high, remember that there are countless other moments and activities with similar kind of results or rewards, like all of the joys and the pleasures that we experience throughout the day. So just keep that in mind. While sugar can have that kind of effect on dopamine in our brains, so can so many other things that are not food or substance related. Now let's talk a little bit about the case for sugar addiction, which up front I am not a supporter of, but we're still going to talk about it because I think it's important to provide more context and give more sides. So talking about the case for sugar addiction. So I want to make it very clear that when people say that they feel like they have a sugar addiction, it's important, in my opinion, to validate that. That feeling that someone feels when they feel like they are addicted to sugar, they feel like they have to have it. It is important to listen to people whenever somebody does come to me and they say that they feel like they have a sugar addiction. That is not in my place or anybody's place, in my opinion, to say like, no, you don't, because that doesn't exist, right? That's not appropriate. But what that does tell me is that that is something that that person is really feeling, really struggling with. And so what can we learn with maybe some other things that are going on that might help with some of that feeling to reduce? And so we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but first let's talk about the case for sugar addiction. Okay, so kind of like what we were saying before about the brain's reward system, sugar can stimulate that activation or can activate that reward system in the brain. And it can do that similarly to some illicit substances. And so when there were studies that found that in the different, now I also want to take a side note and say that I am not a mental health professional. That is something that I will refer out to. And so if you are a mental health professional or any other kind of person who just knows more about this than I do, then definitely feel free to let me know what I got wrong in the comments. I would actually really appreciate that so that I can just, continue to learn. But from what I understand, that in some studies that sugar was able to kind of light up the brain, specific reward centers of the brain, similarly to how some illegal substances can also light up the brain. The argument from those studies was then that because there was that increased activity in the brain, specifically in those pleasure areas, that led to increased cravings and sugar consumption and that further addiction based on the similarities in that dopamine release. But just as we mentioned a little bit earlier, things like listening to music has also shown to have similar effects. It doesn't seem to be as simple as to just the areas that are lit up. So far from the research, it does not seem to suggest that a candy bar is on par with illicit drugs as far as addiction goes. There's also another important study that is often used in the case for sugar addiction. We'll get to that in a little bit. We need food to live. Our bodies even create glucose. And when we consume glucose, it doesn't mean that our body's ability to create glucose is reduced. Even if we reduce the amount of glucose coming in, our bodies will still be able to provide that. Now, in my opinion, it is essential to differentiate the difference between something that is enjoyable and feels like you are pulled to do something rather than something that is truly addictive. Now, here's where it gets a little bit interesting. I think it's super interesting. Sugar addiction research is actually starting to show that sugar restriction seems to be the strongest indicator for perceived sugar addiction. So a great example of this is a study with mice where they had different groups. One of them was provided free access to their normal food and also sugar, and the other group was restricted the regular food, and then when provided the sugar, they did exhibit kind of binging activity. But the group that did not have that restriction had some of the sugar, but not the same amount in nearly the same amount or consistency that the group with restriction had. And this is something that anecdotally I see in a lot of people that I have worked with, and how when we start to reduce some of that restriction on them, that sugar cravings can start to decrease, because it's kind of that whole, if I know that I can't have it, I want it kind of thing. Now, I do want to make a caveat to that. Sometimes when people are stepping into a non-diet kind of approach, they can kind of, it's that whole pendulum kind of swing where the restriction has been set for so long that when they let go, for some people, sometimes they can see this kind of increased intake that almost feels uncontrollable. And how I like to describe that is this kind of analogy. Now, I've heard this analogy from several different dietitians. I don't know who created it, but it's one that I love. And it's kind of the idea of diet air. So if you can imagine yourself underwater with a straw trying to breathe air. Let's imagine you get up out of that body of water and you're able to fully take in oxygen. Now, since you have been able to take in some oxygen, you're still going to be, able to get up out of the water, but you're probably going to be taking these deep breaths that are not really controllable. But after a little while, when your body realizes or recognizes that you have access to all of that air, the breathing then doesn't need to be as deep. It can kind of slow down and regulate kind of normal breathing patterns. Now, in a similar way, when we can kind of look at dieting in that way, when someone gets up out of the water or gets rid of those restrictive plans, sometimes what can happen is their body has this kind of what feels uncontrollable intake. Now, at this time, this is a very important time. It can feel kind of scary. And so one of the safest things to do for a lot of people is to go back under that water, back to that diet air, to relieve themselves from that kind of perceived overconsumption, or maybe it is actual overconsumption and they feel very uncomfortable with that, like physically in pain from that consumption after kind of getting up out of the water and having that kind of intake. And so what happens is sometimes people see that and perceive that as like intuitive eating, and it feels a little bit scary, and so they'll like go back underwater when that's not actually the case. And there's a lot of things that we can do within that very uncomfortable time that can kind of help move through that in order to avoid getting back underwater and have those more kind of like normal intake, what feels good, not really even having to think about it so much, like when we're just regularly breathing. I kind of went off on a tangent there, but that is, I think, a really good example. And that study specifically is often used to say, like, well, this group, when they were given access to that sugar, they did have those kind of binging actions. But a lot of times what gets taken out of context is also the other group that had free access to their food and was not put into any kind of restrictive state. Now, another point in the case against sugar addiction is the idea of withdrawal. I have a really hard time saying that word. Withdrawal. It just sounds funny in my head when I say it. Withdrawal. With withdrawal and tolerance. Now, with sugar intake, we don't see this kind of tolerance where someone has to have like more sugar as they continue on, right? So they might feel that they're addicted to sugar in the afternoons, but when you look at a period of time, they're not necessarily like increasing the amount significantly of sugar consumed when they feel like they have that. Future Cat here, I realized that after I recorded this, edited this, and was about to post it, I really wanted to check in with some of the points or topics that I brought up, specifically talking with a mental health professional who is focused on addiction. I reached out to Megan Williams, who is the author of Cutting Ties, Healing After MLM, which the description reads is a self-guided workbook to start processing the emotions and internal work that comes with making a major major life decision. I want to read a little bit of our discussion as I reached out and talked to her a little bit about this topic for this video specifically. So she said that there have been some withdrawal type symptoms that come when folks cut out sugar after overindulgence. Dizziness, disorientation, and irritability can happen. I've seen it more in folks who go from tons of sugar to an extreme diet like keto or Whole30. The other piece is that a lot of folks who claim sugar addiction have binge eating disorders, some diagnosed, most not. That is the actual diagnosis versus sugar addiction, which is not. There has never been empirical evidence to suggest that sugar itself is addictive in humans. It's the chasing of the dopamine using food as the mechanism. The other caveat is that many times therapists will recommend sugar as a replacement for alcohol since alcohol is a complex sugar. And she mentions keeping chocolate on hand for opiate or disordered folks because of how it works in the brain. And in those scenarios, sugar acts as a buffer for the craving in the brain. So I will leave a link for her information down below, but thank you, Megan, for commenting on this. All right, let's get back to the video. Now, some studies also kind of take it a step further and suggest that it might be more of the combination that seems to have a more addictive kind of behavior or outcome. So specifically with added sugars paired with fats and processed in certain ways. Essentially ways that are made to make those foods more palatable, or hyperpalatable foods. Now, just because something is hyperpalatable does not mean that it is addictive, but it does highlight the point that how specific ingredients interact can play a role in consumption of the actual food. But again, that's not the same thing as an addiction. Now, we also need to talk about the role of environment and just behavioral factors when it comes into this topic. External cues and our habits and societal norms can have an impact on our sugar consumption. So if we think about events that typically have some kind of sugar added to them, one of my favorite things of just humans in general is the fact that all different cultures throughout time can gather around food. But going beyond that, there are specific kind of events that might just societal cues that we might consume more sugar at, like birthday parties, graduation parties within our society and the environment to just kind of nudge us in the way to include some sugars in those kind of events. And there's also different ties to sugar intake, whether it's feelings of happiness or sadness, boredom, feeling frustrated, upset. There can be emotional connections from our emotions to specific foods. And a lot of times those foods might be added sugar foods. So there might also be some like emotional eating at play too. Now, a side note to that, emotional eating is not something that is inherently bad. Usually when I do approach emotional eating with someone, we have come to the conclusion that it's causing more harm than good. So just as a side note, like it's not something that necessarily has to be fixed, but if it is not helping you to feel better, then typically it's going to be beneficial to kind of be able to unpack that and approach that, because going back to what I had mentioned earlier in this video, it's about that informed choice and being empowered in making those choices. And that's one reason why I really like to bring curiosity into the picture when approaching food. That way we can see, like, why am I craving that? Is it something that I am truly craving just a taste or experience flavor of? Or is it something else that's maybe going on underneath that I really don't want that specifically? It's curiosity is just something that I really encourage people to bring to the plate when they are approaching food in order to be more aligned with their body and to make those more informed choices. Now, going back to sugar cravings, I briefly mentioned this before, but there are so many reasons why someone might feel that they have sugar cravings, intense ones even. It could be related to their sleep or lack of sleep or their total energy intake. If they're not consuming enough calories, oftentimes our bodies will remind us of that by increasing sugar cravings. It could also be that they're not consuming enough protein at meals or throughout the day. It could also be related to maybe they had a higher intense workout, or they added an additional kind of activity to their day and they just need a little bit more intake. It could also be related to higher levels of stress or feeling like they're a little bit out of control. There are a lot of different reasons why someone can have sugar cravings. And again, I don't want to invalidate anybody's lived experience. At that same time, I can also anecdotally say and research-wise say that there are many things that we can do to change the kind of picture of how we're approaching food that can impact or might be able to impact those cravings by reducing them. And I think that is awesome. So when we're approaching sugar, it's really easy. I think it's really easy to just kind of want to put it in this bad category or put it in this category where you just kind of try to leave it to the side. When we label a food or a food category as just inherently bad, we're essentially oversimplifying nutrition, a very nuanced topic that takes into account biochemistry, anatomy and physiology, psychology, anthropology, so many other factors, right? Like nutrition is one of those areas of study that it has so many different areas in science specifically that plays a role into it. It's one of the reasons why I love it. There's so much more to learn. At that same time, we also have a really good foundation of what we know that helps people with their health, their physical health. And so while we do have a lot to learn, there is also a lot that we do know that we can implement and that we know can also help with things like perceived sugar addiction. And when we oversimplify nutrition by putting sugar in this kind of like bad category, it can miss out some of the benefits that it can offer and overlook the like broader picture of our intake. Benefits, not just the physiology wise, like if somebody is having low blood sugar or right before heavy lifts or a run, but also like the other maybe more psychological benefits we might get from it by consuming something with a group of friends or family, or just having that joy, the enjoyments of that. That is something that is valuable too. And so I am just not a fan of putting it in like an inherently bad category. Our bodies are complex, our lives are complex, and every nutrient, every kind of intake can play a role, even sugar. Anyway, I don't want somebody to like clip this out and be like, this dietitian is telling people to go out and have added sugars. That is not the context of what I'm saying. If it's not something they are already consuming, I'm just saying how we approach it can really make an impact on the feeling that we need to have it, right? So when I am working with people, I will say also that a lot of times this kind of sugar addiction conversation comes up, and so we're able to approach it. And so one of the coolest things that I really enjoy seeing is when I can see that people are starting to eat more vegetables, eat more fruits, eat more nutrient dense foods, and really enjoy them and approach them as something to include because they want to, because they feel good with that, and really focusing on adding things to their intake so that we don't have to focus so much on taking away things. And when we're adding a lot of nutrient dense foods to their intake, typically what happens is that kind of foods that maybe aren't serving them so much can kind of get crowded out. So I just wanted to make that note really quick. My main focus and what I want to really encourage you is what can we do to be more informed about how foods impact our energy, and approaching that food with curiosity, compassion, and context, and recognizing that doing this kind of all or nothing, good or bad list isn't, when we look at behavior change and long-term change, a healthy relationship with food. That's not typically something that we see aligned with something like that. So kind of wrapping up, nutrition science, the world of nutrition is nuanced. When it comes to topics specifically about sugar addiction, it is really easy to get swept up into headlines and kind of clickbait articles. In my opinion, it's important that we dive deeper and look at the finer points of what potentially could be going on and why this could be something very much perceived, and really try to separate the facts from sensationalism and clickbait. So let me know in the comments if this is something that you have experienced, a feeling like sugar addiction, if it is something that you are currently experiencing. I know there are some people who feel very strong that sugar is addicting. Again, going back to what is the context in which that sugar feels addicting? When was the last time they were able to have that meal or have a meal that was filled with protein and nourishing fats and fiber-rich carbohydrates, vegetables? Are they getting enough sleep? Are they getting enough water? Like, to me, hearing the term sugar addiction really is a signal to me to see what else is going on. Because again, typically if we can address a lot of those challenges, what we see is this kind of reduction in that feeling of sugar addiction, which then goes back to the idea of addiction. And if it was truly an addiction, and if we address all these things, how are they still able to have that glucose, incorporate that, and not feel that same kind of addiction? Let me know your thoughts, and if you like this video, please leave a like. Make sure you're subscribed. I would greatly appreciate that. And remember, you can strive for health without subscribing to diet culture. I'll see you later. Bye.